Moving on, we're talking about primordials today. Now, where to start? Primordials are easily some of the most important creatures within the entire Adventure Time story, and because of that, this actually may be one of the longest videos I have ever done, so pack up your things, get a snack, because this might take a while. Starting off, what exactly is a primordial creature? And the answer is pretty simple. They are a unique form of monster that basically existed before time and existence ever began, basically before the Big Bang. While calling them monsters isn't exactly fair, they're closer to concepts given physical form. Regardless, one thing you should be aware of is that there is no such thing as a good primordial. Every single primordial that we have ever encountered has always shown a complete disregard for mortal life. Coconteppi raised an entire cult-like following which continuously sacrificed each other as well as destroy entire countries just for fun. Orgalorg destroyed entire worlds, conquered an entire solar system, and devoured thousands of populations just because he thought it would be kind of funny. And don't even get me started on the Lich or the various prisoners that were in the Citadel. Now, despite this incredibly bleak picture, I actually do not believe they do this out of malice, but more so due to the way they have been created. If you were an incredibly powerful cosmic entity, where the only thing that could possibly match you are gods who were created by your own thoughts and imagination, and the cosmic powers that are already above you in the first place, humility is no longer an option, it's a punchline. However, obviously there's always exceptions, and it's possible there were some that decided to be different, but I highly doubt it considering they all seem to be chaotic monsters. Now, even though they all seem to share some traits from one another, it should be noted that every single one of them is different in terms of their core beliefs. There's also a matter of their form. I already mentioned how every single one possesses their own unique beliefs, but their forms are also just as chaotic. Some are the size of entire planets, others are smaller but possess unique features such as tendrils that can absorb the essence of various creatures. Due to their chaotic nature, their form can pretty much be anything you can imagine and can be as terrifying as you can imagine. There's also a matter of power. The primordials are seriously some of the most powerful entities in all of existence. A good example of this would be Coconteppi. Coconteppi had such an understanding of the universe that he became one of the first wizards to ever exist. His affinity for it was so great that simply consuming some of his blood would give you godlike power. Pretty much every single spell that you can possibly imagine is something that he was fully capable of utilizing. Yes, this even includes wish magic. So reality warping is completely on the table just when you're talking about Coconteppi alone. You also need to realize that due to the fact that they existed prior to time itself, they are completely aware of how time works and exist in every single timeline and difference in reality. To put this in a simple term, they share one mind across an eternal cosmos. This also makes them functionally immortal both in the physical sense as well as the cosmic sense. When I say in the physical sense, I mean it quite literally. They are incredibly hard to put down even by destroying their physical bodies. Orgalorg was still able to speak and was completely sentient and was able to regenerate even after having his entire upper body completely destroyed by Finn. Coconteppi's body was completely obliterated, however his heart continued to pump blood and he was still somewhat sentient. He was even capable of completely reincarnating himself with all of his memories and understanding of the universe as long as someone consumed his blood. This somewhat leads me to believe that they are somewhat immortal as long as their essence, or at least some piece of them, survives. Unless of course something in particular was specifically designed to kill them, but we'll talk about that later. It's also nearly impossible to kill them in the cosmic sense, because even if you completely destroy one of their vessels, they are continuously existing in every single dimension of reality naturally. And as I mentioned before, every single one of these vessels and incarnations completely know everything every other vessel of theirs knows. So basically they are a hive mind. And the only way to deal with them is to completely wipe them from every single form of existence at the same time, which still results in you having to kill at least one of them, which is already next to impossible. But moving on, let's talk about each individual primordial that we currently know about. Starting off strong, we have Orgalorg, who is one of the worst cosmic entities just by the sheer amount of cosmic crimes he has committed. Believe it or not, Orgalorg was one of the smallest entities that we saw within the Sea of Monsters. Now, size doesn't actually always equal power, but if it does in this particular instance, that would mean that Orgalorg was actually one of the weakest of all of the primordials that we currently know about. If that actually is the case, let that sink in, because this guy was still more powerful than 90% of the entire cast of Adventure Time. Now, a long time ago after time originally began, he began his conquest, taking over entire planets as well as an entire solar system to boot. Now, he would rule as a tyrant for an incredibly long period of time, in which he would then proceed to conquer various planets and destroy various planets along with their populations, committing mass genocide. It is stated that he continuously looked for greater power in order to become an even greater threat to the cosmos. Luckily for him, he possesses a very unique ability which allows him to absorb the essence of any creature. When he desires to assimilate another creature, he will envelop them and then begin digging various tendrils within their body. This process is relatively quick, but is incredibly painful for anyone who is still alive while being consumed. The tendrils will begin sucking out the essence as well as the nutrients within whatever is actually being consumed, and then will apply it to his own body. Now, it is unknown whether or not the creatures that he absorbs actually die or if they continuously live as part of him, but honestly I like to think about it this way, mainly because it adds a whole new level of horror to something that is already terrifying. Now, after he absorbs another creature, he will gain everything that they possessed: their knowledge, their powers, their unique genetic code. Every single thing that they were capable of doing is now something that he can do. He can even absorb their cosmic energies in order to gain access to powers and domains that he has no business messing with. Now, considering that we know he most likely consumed various other creatures, it's possible that many of the abilities that he showcased are possibly not even his own, but instead powers he stole from others. Speaking of which, let's talk about those abilities. For one, he possesses incredible control over his own physical shape, allowing him to shapeshift his body in pretty much any way to suit his own needs, whether it be lengthening certain parts of his body or flat out changing his form entirely in order to consume something. There are pretty much no limitations here. Well, at least not any limitations that have been abundantly made clear. Not only that, but he has interstellar flight. This allows him to move at such incredible speeds that he's able to get from planet to planet within the matter of minutes. He also has incredible strength and stamina with pretty much no chance of ever becoming exhausted. He also seems to possess some level of energy projection, however all he's really shown is the ability to create holograms. He is also immune to having his soul taken by someone like Hunts and Abadir. However, despite all this power, he would still get his butt handed to him by both Finn as well as Glob. Theoretically speaking, however, if he were to have absorbed the Catalyst Comet along with Finn, considering he also possesses the essence of another Catalyst Comet plus the Grass Sword, he would have been one of the most powerful entities within the entire universe. It should also be noted that he does in fact have a biological child who possesses cosmic importance as it has shown magical capabilities. Moving on, we have coconteppi. Now, coconteppi does not have too much information, but I can work with what we got. Coconteppi was one of the first wizards to ever exist within the land of Ooo, and he was the one who created Wizard City. Pretty much all magic that is utilized today is in some way connected to his original teachings, which is why so many people call him the source of all magic. Now, why exactly he would teach mortals magic, considering he has shown that he absolutely despises all mortals, is unknown. It's possible he just did it for entertainment, but it's also possible they picked it up as they went, but regardless, it would result in the creation of Wizard City and a cult-like following. The population of Wizard City would worship him like a god, and in doing so inflate his already inflated ego. Now, when you take a city of magic users, give them in the hands of a corrupt, incredibly powerful, near god-like entity who hates all life similar to that of the Lich, you are going to get some pretty bad results. Wizard City was overrun with dark magic, and they would utilize it in order to pretty much dominate a good portion of the world, all while doing various sacrifices and absolute degeneracy, all in the name of coconteppi. However, a select group of wizards would actually rebel against coconteppi in hopes to restore the balance within the world. Many fans believe that this was the event that caused the creation of Bella Noche in hopes to utilize her as a super weapon in order to fight coconteppi, which actually makes sense when you factor in coconteppi's absolute dominance over magical power. With only a cup of his blood, meaning that he wasn't even a tenth as powerful as he was supposed to be, he was able to completely outclass multiple high-ranking wizards. In this very weakened state, mind you, he showed abilities such as disintegration, the ability to harm astral bodies, as well as the ability to create flames that would completely erase someone from existence. But at the height of his power, he had pretty much every single ability that you could possibly imagine. Despite all this power, however, he would be bested by the rebels and would be sealed underneath all of Wizard City. However, he was still not dead. Not only was he still sentient despite the destruction of his body, but his heart would still beat. And as it beats, it continuously oozes out his blood, which if consumed will allow him to completely take over a new vessel and transform it into a new body for himself if they have enough willpower and potential to control his potential abilities. Something I should mention, however, is that a small piece of coconteppi's energies are within Chuskus as he consumed a diluted form of his blood. Next up, we have the Lich, and here's the thing. A lot of people gave me a lot of flack saying that he's not a primordial, and I beg to differ. Every single bit of evidence points at the Lich being a primordial after the idea of primordials was introduced. So let's start off with Exhibit A. Now, this one is particularly obvious this, it's the fact that he had complete memory of everything that happened during the Sea of Monsters. And not only was he aware enough to know that the Sea of Monsters existed, but was able to actively represent specific entities that we know existed during that time, such as the orgalorg. Another thing that I thought I should mention is that many people believe that this was simply due to the fact that he was a catalyst comet and they were stated to know everything between the beginning and the end. This is not the case. Which leads me to Exhibit B, which is the fact that Finn had no memory of the Sea of Monsters. If we follow the idea that the comets know everything between the beginning and the end, then Finn himself, being a catalyst comet, would have the memory of the Sea of Monsters, but he doesn't, even after fully opening the vault on numerous occasions. This means that catalyst comets technically exist within the stream of time, and can see the beginning of time and the end of time, but not anything before it. However, as I mentioned, he has complete memory of this particular event, meaning he does not have that weakness, and him being a primordial would be a direct answer to that. Lastly, he has also shown that he not only shares many of the narcissistic traits that various other primordials possess, but he also has shown that he has an incredible respect for other ancients like himself. With that being said, let's continue. Now, the Lich is getting his own video eventually, so I'm not going to add too many details here. That being said, I'll give you a quick summary. The Lich is the literal embodiment of the death of all things and evil incarnate, and because of that, he pretty much destroys everything he comes into contact with, no matter how long it takes. Now, he is incredibly intelligent, and will actively go out of his way to pretty much scheme over centuries in order to fulfill his one desire, which is to destroy all life. For the most part, he does this without malice. He does not do this because he hates all life, but due to the fact that it is ingrained into his mind. In fact, if he is ever put in a situation where mass death is impossible, he will enter a catatonic state in which he will continuously plan out a way to make it possible. Now, he will go to any length in order to achieve this one goal, whether it be to obtain a wish from a wishmaster or taking over the literal embodiment of death to suit his own means. Now, the reason I'm keeping it light on the Lich is due to the fact that, again, he's getting his own video, and the other two have not been in anywhere near as many episodes as him, and I will be here all day if I were to actually go over everything. Now, moving on, one thing I should also mention is that the ancients, or the primordials, are on the cusp of extinction. And you may be wondering, well, how is that possible? I literally had an entire section detailing how they are very hard to kill and are pretty much immortal. Well, let me introduce you to the speculation section as well as the primordial war theory. Now, the primordial war theory is a theory that I personally made, which details a war that takes place sometime after time originally began, which saw to the destruction of various primordials. Now, I actually have quite a few videos that are around this particular subject, so I'm going to be linking them in the description below, but I will try to add as much detail as I can here. Now, the primordial war theory is based around three things. The first is very simple, which is the fact that the primordials are on the cusp of extinction, which is something that is incredibly hard to comprehend when you realize that they numbered in the millions and were more powerful than pretty much 90% of the things within Adventure Time. Another reason why I believe this took place is due to the Lich. As I mentioned before, I believe the Lich was a primordial monster. However, if this is the case, he would have had to die in order to be reincarnated as a catalyst comet. Considering that the Lich, the literal embodiment of the death of all things, had his body destroyed and he was reincarnated, definitely is something that I believe should not be overlooked, especially since this is a similar fate that many other primordials shared. There's also the matter of the Citadel. The Citadel is a cosmic prison, which was specifically designed in order to house some of the most dangerous cosmic entities within the entire multiverse. And considering that a good amount of the prisoners within the Citadel were primordials, this raises a lot of questions. First off, we have to figure out who and what their enemies were during this time. Remember, time had just begun, and with time and the creation of the multiverse, new things were beginning to arise. Remember, before there was nothing, there were monsters, and the fact of the matter was they lived within a chaotic soup. Death did not exist, nor did the idea of time exist. What this basically means is that incredibly powerful cosmic entities that we are aware of, such as Death, Glob, and various others, only appear after the universe was created. Regardless of how exactly they get there, there was a major shift in power, and now the primordials had a rival. Now, you may be thinking that I'm just grasping at straws, however, I do not believe I am because of two particular characters, which would be Darren and Ellie. Darren and Ellie are sentient constructs whose entire purpose was to wage war. Here's the thing, Darren has a very interesting ability, and this power is to erase creatures across all of existence. And what kind of creature is unkillable unless you completely wipe them from existence? The primordials. In fact, prior to his resurrection by the hands of the Sky Witch, he flat out detailed a battle in which creatures were able to create more of themselves utilizing their own blood. Another thing that I thought I should mention is that Darren flat out states and behaves as though he predates the elements. This, along with the fact that Ellie was created around the same time in order to fight a very dangerous dangerous war, I believe that these two were basically comrades within the Primordial War. There's also the matter of the Citadel, because the fact of the matter is the Citadel was specifically made utilizing constructs in order to serve a particular purpose, which in this case was to contain various Primordials who had done cosmic crimes. And considering that we know killing cosmic entities is considered a cosmic crime, this would make sense why they are there. Considering that the sun is older than Ellie, I would assume that this war has to take place a couple billion years before the main story. Now, another thing that I thought I should mention would be exactly what happens to a Primordial after they die. Now, although this isn't entirely correct, it's possible that they get reincarnated into a new form. Considering that the Lich himself was reincarnated into the Catalyst Comet of Evil, it's possible that others have been reincarnated into Catalyst Comets or into a different form altogether. Now, for those of you who do not know, Shoko is Finn's previous incarnation. She existed around 400 to 500 years prior to the main story, and her life was just as tragic as her death. But before I go over that, I need to talk about something that has been bothering me ever since I began researching this character. Because the question that I've been asking was whether or not she was a ghost or not. And for any other character, I would immediately say yes, because we know where ghosts come from. In order to become a ghost that's stuck in the mortal world, you obviously have to die, but then one of three things have to happen in order for you to stay on the mortal world. The first is that you forget your cause of death, which tends to happen if you died in a particularly tragic way, such as getting killed by your own lover. This is personally what happened to Ghost Princess after her original death. The next way of being stuck on the mortal world is if you have some kind of unfinished business, which obviously people would attribute to Shoko. And the final way is to be kept on the mortal world against your will, such as the case with the couples under the Fight King's jurisdiction. Of course, there are many methods and ways you could stay on the mortal world, but these are the three main ones that we know about. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up in particular is due to the fact that obviously, going by what I just explained, she would be a ghost. The problem is that she is Finn, she is his reincarnation, so how exactly is she haunting a place when her soul is in an entirely different vessel? We also can't use the multiple soul theory due to the fact that in Together Again, we find out that it's the exact same soul being reincarnated every single time. So half of the argument says that she's a ghost, and the other half says that she's not. However, I believe that there's a third option, and remember, this is entirely speculation, so take this with a grain of salt. It's possible that due to the fact she has unfinished business, she's actively haunting the area that Finn currently inhabits due to the fact that her soul is still within him, and that all of the ghostly occurrences that we see whenever she appears is entirely due to Finn. A secondary bit of evidence to back this up would be the fact that no one else can see her. In the land of Ooo, ghosts may be intangible as well as transparent, but they are still visual. So the fact that only Finn can see her makes me wonder if she's actively tormenting him, not entirely on purpose, but simply to fulfill their remaining business in order to seek atonement. Anyway, with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about her life rather than her death. Now, as I mentioned before, Shoko appears around 400 to 500 years prior to the main story. Now, I created a small timeline in my Billy video, so if you guys want to hear more about that, the link will be in the description. Now, as you would imagine, living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland isn't exactly that great for your mental or physical health, and it's clear from her appearance that much like Billy, her parents as well as ancestors were mutated, and this resulted in her looking different than your average human as well. Speaking of parents, hers were absolutely terrible. It's possible that she was lying, however, I find that very unlikely due to the fact that she breaks down after Bubblegum gave her a new arm. So this means her parents actually did end up cutting her arm off in exchange for a decently built computer. Eventually, her parents would abandon her, and this would result in her doing everything she can in order to survive, becoming a vagabond. She would travel for quite some time and would eventually befriend a tiger. We would later learn that this was Jake's past life, which is actually really cool, as it kind of adds on to the fact that no matter what form they end up taking, they almost always end up partnering up one way or another. However, moving on from that, she would eventually become a thief, specifically doing jobs for the Bath Boy gang at least on more than one occasion. She would eventually live as a thief long enough to the point where she'd be considered a pro, to the point where they would even try to get her to steal Princess Bubblegum's amulet, a job that was definitely considered incredibly important. She would take the job, however, the Bath Boy gang leader would threaten her with death if she were to fail. Wanting money as well as not wanting to die, she would immediately try to steal the amulet, screaming and then knocking herself out right outside of its walls in order for them to bring her in as some kind of victim. She would quickly try to gain Princess Bubblegum's trust, however, this would slowly result in a friendship between the two. She would even be partially responsible for the creation of the Gumball Guardians that we are also accustomed to. Surprisingly, Princess Bubblegum would become one of the first individuals that she would ever meet to seem like an upstanding individual, and would serve as an example of Shoko's first experience with a good person. Now, unfortunately, this would make a rift between the two, as she originally came in order to steal the amulet. But after Princess Bubblegum showed her the affection that she wanted her entire life, as well as made her an artificial arm, she immediately broke down crying. Now, although it's pretty short, this is actually a very crucial moment for her character, as it pretty much puts in everything into perspective. Despite the fact that she does in fact have to do the job or she'll be killed, she does second guess herself, showing that even when her life was at stake, she was still considering the moral option. However, believing that it was too late for her, she would say sorry to Princess Bubblegum while still in her tent and then attempt to take the amulet. However, this would not go well for her whatsoever. She would attempt to take the amulet while Princess Bubblegum was sleeping, however, would be caught by one of the Gumball Guardians. She would try to escape, however, would be blasted by the Gumball Guardian and land directly into a large pool of toxic waste. Princess Bubblegum would attempt to save her by getting the Gumball Guardians to fish her out, however, this would result in their hands being melted off. Believing she was dead, Princess Bubblegum would retreat back into her castle, though as it turns out, she did in fact survive, though not for long as she was heavily mutated. Now, I originally wanted to skip this section, however I believe her mutation and death is absolutely pivotal to her character, so I'm going to go over it here, because the fact is the way she dies is far more tragic and gruesome than a lot of people give it credit for. After emerging from the toxic waste, it is clear that her body had changed in many horrifying ways. For one, it seems as though her legs had merged together, creating one long line of flesh which was elongated with the additional mutations. And considering that this is toxic waste we're talking about, the additional growths and lumps throughout her body are most likely cancerous tumors. And considering she also grew an additional arm, it's clear that her bones were also affected by the mutagen as well, being extended and elongated, most likely far past what their natural limits are supposed to be. Something that should also be mentioned is that her skin is either producing a continuous mucus or is in the continuous state of melting. And considering that we know that the waste was in fact corrosive, I honestly believe that her skin actually is continuously melting. Or it could be a combination of both. Regardless, it is clear that this is not painless, as when she erupted from the river, she immediately showed that she was in immense pain. She would manage to drag herself out of the river as well as a couple miles down, where she would die right then and there, with the sun rising and right next to the sapling that would eventually become Finn and Jake's house. The corpse would remain there embedded in branches until Finn would later discover it in the episode The Vault. However, as I mentioned before, this is not the end of her story. Haunted by the fact that she had betrayed one of her only friends as well as died in an incredibly tragic way, she would begin to haunt Finn, appearing in his dreams, nightmares, and even manifesting as illusions at specific locations. This would get to the point where he would begin sleepwalking and specifically destroying the location where her body was actually hidden, showing that what she really just wanted to do was for him to discover her and finally redeem her by returning the amulet, something Finn would finally do after regaining his memories, finally redeeming her after hundreds of years. Now here's the thing about the crater, there is literally an infinite number of possibilities on what could have caused it, so I think the best way to start this off would be talking about the things that couldn't have caused it. Starting off strong, there is absolutely no way that the humans managed to cause that explosion. A lot of people were talking about how they were saying they made mistakes while displaying the destroyed Earth. And yes, they did make mistakes considering that they were directly responsible for its destruction with the mushroom bomb, but there was no way they were directly involved in terms of the explosion that caused the crater. Now the reason I believe this is simply due to the fact that they did not have the technology necessary to do something like that at the time. You need to remember that after the mushroom bomb, all hell broke loose. When the Lich was unleashed, he possessed an entire undead army which killed thousands. Pretty much every form of government dissolved within the year, and the remaining humans were either dead, dying, or mutated. Even the survivors who were somehow able to get to the island came via boats, which were made out of wood, and a couple had decent submarines, which were scavenged, not built. Even on the island, it took them centuries in order to get their technology anywhere close to how it was at the beginning of the story. And I know some of you are probably going to bring up how there was a secondary mushroom explosion, however I do not believe that was from the humans but by the Lich himself, considering he has shown the ability to cause such massive explosions by utilizing his well of power. And even if they possessed the technology necessary in order to cause damage like that, why would they utilize it to knock out a full 10% of the planet? And what could they possibly have found in order to cause that much destructive ability if the mushroom bomb, which was very recent and housed the essence of the Lich, which is literally the embodiment of evil, and it wasn't even a 10th as powerful as that explosion? Moving on was the idea that it was a catalyst comet. Many people believe that around this time, Finn's catalyst comet hit the Earth sometime after the mushroom bomb, which makes sense considering this does take place 1,000 years before the main story. Whether it was Finn or not, this doesn't really change the fact that I still believe this is improbable. The catalyst comet hits Earth every 1,000 years and has been doing so since the dinosaurs. This means that there are thousands of catalyst comets that are unaccounted for, and not a single one did as much damage as that explosion to the Earth. The green catalyst comet managed to destroy all of the dinosaurs and did cause some disasters, but nowhere near to the point of destroying a full quarter of the planet nearly. We also know that depending on what exactly the comet embodies, it will have a different effect on the planet, so the entire idea that this is Finn and the comet managed to destroy an entire section despite being the comet of good, I just don't see it happening. One thing that should be noted is that in Farm World, a timeline where the bomb never went off, this never occurs, meaning that the explosion that destroyed a good portion of the world is directly responsible to some degree to the mushroom bomb. And as many types of subjects on this channel, we have to talk about the Lich. Considering the Lich around this time was trying his best in order to create a particular ritual which would have allowed him to consume the entire planet, it's possible that this may have been a byproduct of that. However, this doesn't work either because Princess Bubblegum flat out stated that before he could even begin the ritual, Billy managed to defeat him. It couldn't have been coconteppi because he was defeated millions of years prior to the main story, and it couldn't have been orgalorg because in the flashback we see that he simply transformed into Gunther and then fell into the ocean. So the amount of options I'm left with in order to figure out exactly what happened to the planet are incredibly low. However, I actually do possess a theory based on what we see from the crater. In the episode Sons of Mars, we actually see the crater for the first time as well as debris that came from the explosion. And surprisingly, the debris seems to be all manner of food. Now you may be thinking I'm just going crazy and just grabbing whatever I can, but listen, this actually is somewhat important. Every single piece of food that we end up seeing seems to possess some attributes to one of the elements, being slime, candy, ice, and fire. The reason this is important is due to the fact that we see all of these foods within the flashback and thought process of the old tart torter. And here's the thing, we have no idea exactly when the explosion takes place, only that it takes place after the original mushroom bomb. And considering the old tart toter seems to have some insight into this particular event, even though he's not even as ancient as Princess Bubblegum herself, tells me something pretty interesting. What if Princess Bubblegum attempted to create her own super weapon by tangling with forces she didn't fully understand, and the results were devastating? Now, this wouldn't be the first crime against humanity as well as the entire planet that she's done so far, but at the same time I still find her destroying a good portion of the planet pretty unlikely. This would explain all the candy-based debris, but aside from that, there really isn't too much to really tether her to this particular event. It seems we're going to be talking about the humans today. Now, the humans are easily one of the most tragic creatures within the entire Adventure Time story. And I know at this point it's kind of become a running gag how basically every single creature within the Adventure Time universe is some way tragic or sad, but in this case it really is true. The humans were put into a dire situation on numerous occasions, which is why so many people believe that Finn was truly the last human. Now, there is a lot to go over in this particular subject, so with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. 1,000 years prior to the main story, the mushroom bomb would serve as a catalyst, but this is not where it actually begins. Before the Mushroom Bomb was the Mushroom War, a particularly bloody war in which pretty much everyone was involved. Many fans speculate that this was this world's equivalent of World War II, and considering the planes that we end up seeing within Simon's flashbacks, well specifically on the tapes, this does actually match the description of many planes during that era. Regardless on whether or not this was actually World War II or not, one thing remains clear: one side got incredibly desperate. This all culminates into the dropping of the Mushroom Bomb. Now, I have multiple videos detailing the Mushroom Bomb, and all of them are within a playlist that will be in the description. With that being said, I'll go ahead and give a brief summary here. The Mushroom Bomb was a super weapon specifically designed out of magic as well as technological advancement. It was both holding as well as powered by the very essence that would eventually become the Lich. When this bomb was dropped, all hell broke loose, and it would ultimately be the catalyst that pretty much every single thing within Adventure Time was based off of. Now, when the bomb was dropped, although it did massive amounts of damage to civilization and many humans, it wasn't actually the bomb itself, but the reincarnation of the Lich that would prove to be a major problem. When the Lich was born by the explosion, he immediately began resurrecting pretty much every single dead human within a certain radius and creating a massive army. Due to the fact that civilization had suffered a massive hit, there was pretty much no one around who was actually able to stop him nor his army. This resulted in the Lich pretty much destroying every single bit of civilization that was still on Ooo. However, humanity was not completely destroyed, as there were stragglers as well as small communities worth who were trying to get away. However, many of them would die as well. The radiation sickness that many people would ultimately face would result in many just dying from that. A good example of this would be Marceline's mom, who would eventually succumb to radiation sickness, coughing up blood, and eventually just dying within a small abandoned building. Many humans would attempt to escape into vaults in order to avoid the radiation as well as the various dangerous mutants throughout all of Ooo. However, many of these vaults would become compromised. A good example of this would be the clubhouse within the episode Obsidian. Considering when Marceline came back, they had all died seemingly doing some level of activity, it's possible they either died due to sickness, radiation sickness, or some other affliction. It's also very unlikely that this is the only vault. However, considering that we literally see no other humans within Ooo, these vaults were either abandoned, compromised, or broken into by the mutant population. Many humans who couldn't find vaults either died due to radiation sickness, starved to death, or were torn apart by the various mutant populations. But don't worry, things get much worse. On top of the oozers, the Lich's army, the mutants, the disease, the starvation, and basically everything else I've already described, the world decided that it wanted to be a jerk and have beef with humanity in particular, so one thing that ended up happening was the vampires finally made their move. You see, one thing that remains clear is that the vampires worked in secrecy because if the humans had ever considered them a problem with their government unity and technology, they could easily wipe out the vampires. However, after the Mushroom Bomb, this became a non-factor, which resulted in them hunting them down even further. They would wipe out entire communities worth of humans, and humans would either be taken in as thralls, taken in to be transformed into more vampires, or consumed altogether. Marceline even stated that their atrocities against humanity were so bad that the only fair punishment was for them to be staked over 1,000 times. Now, the vampires would eventually be defeated, but at that point, the humans were dwindled to such a low number that they were basically already extinct. But don't worry, things get much worse. You see, in an unknown event, one major explosion would cause a massive chunk of the world to be blown off, which would kill even more humans, reducing their already abysmal numbers into something even lower. At this point, the amount of humans that actually existed could probably be counted upwards in the hundreds. However, things would eventually take a turn for the better. You see, after the vampires vampire attacks or sometime before them, a group of humans would find the islands. Now here's something that's rather interesting. In the show, it is never stated nor said exactly who the founders were. However, in the Islands comic strip, it turns out that the group of humans that Marceline had protected from the vampires would be the ones that would discover and colonize the islands. Now, I'm not going to go in depth because I'm not entirely sure whether or not this comic is still considered canon to the story. However, if it is still canon to the story, this means that Marceline is directly responsible for saving all of humanity, and that every single human that we see on the island, including Finn, Minerva, and Martin, descend from this one particular tribe of humans that Marceline had saved. Now, I would add more detail from the comic simply due to the fact that it answers many of the questions that the Island miniseries left unanswered. However, as I mentioned previously, it is still debated whether or not the comic is still considered canon, so we are going strictly by the show. If you guys want me to cover the comic as a whole, be sure to put it down in the comments below so I know that you're interested. Moving on, this discovery definitely was a godsend simply due to the fact that pretty much every single human was getting murdered by oozers, the Lich, rainicorns, as well as pretty much everything else under the sun. And here's the thing, they actually would prosper on the islands. Their population would slowly grow and they would continuously increase their technology, eventually getting to the point where they were completely self-sustaining and incredibly advanced. Now this took them hundreds of years and they were still incredibly close to extinction, but they definitely were doing much better than they have been for many years. They would utilize this technology in order to help humanity in pretty much any way they can, specifically creating things such as super soldiers. They were also known as the Seekers, and their entire purpose was to basically hunt down other humans for various reasons. Nanochips would be implanted into them, which when utilized could either completely take over their minds or simply upload new information, as well as flat out upgrade their own bodies on a whim. It also seems that the humans here became incredibly religious, seeing the founders, the original humans who found the island, as godlike figures, and as such would progressively increase their own doctrines in the name of the founders. Now there seems to be a collection of jobs which every single person is eventually funneled into. A good example of this would be the helpers and the seekers, and there's bound to be other occupations that we simply don't know about. Now the island is decked out with a buttload of technology which is specifically designed in order to help humanity. A good example of this would be the technology utilized in order to pretty much simulate the 4 seasons. Another good example of this would be the creation of the Golem. Supposedly, the Golem was created by Dr. Gross and is specifically designed in order to protect the island from any invaders, as well as stopping any human from getting out. A concept which is a mainstay when it comes to the islands. You are not allowed to leave the islands, and whenever you try, one of 3 things will happen. One is that if you actually manage to get to the ocean, the Guardian will personally kill you. The other is if you are captured by Seekers before you can even try to escape. And lastly, there's re-education. Now we don't know exactly what happens during re-education, but what we do know is that it is not pleasant. They imply that it has some level of physical violence, and supposedly after going through re-education, typically what results is that the person will give up all hope on trying to escape the island. This also bleeds into their very education system. Seekers are specifically educated to believe that they are helping every single person who tries to leave the island because everything outside of the island is bad, while normal individuals are specifically educated to believe that everything outside of the walls is bad and that you should be afraid of everything. Complacency is the name of the game, and new ideas are never appreciated. Despite the fragility of this system, it actually did work rather well for a pretty decent amount of time. Now obviously, as things progressed, there would be more free thinkers and more people who wanted to escape the island. And because of this, there was in fact a crime syndicate as well as underworld within the islands. This caused unrest as well as more violent proceedings by the Seekers. This would also result in opportunists who would actively try to utilize this particular system in order to gain more money as well as various gadgets. A good example of this would be Martin. However, although the humans were doing relatively well, this would not last. You see, one of the scientists, specifically Dr. Gross and all of her insanity, was working on biological weapons, something you just had to do when your population is already incredibly low and you literally live within a small nitpick of islands. So yeah, it went about as well as any of you could possibly have imagined. The bioweapon, which I will just continuously call the Plague, was released onto the islands, and this caused mass death across the board. Over 65% of the entire population of humans were wiped out in an incredibly short amount of time. But this had more consequences than you could possibly imagine. First off, the Seekers and soldiers were the first to go. Due to the fact that they were directly responsible for maintaining the order in every single one of these islands, this resulted in many of the outer colonies completely falling apart. Humans were now being left behind during evacuations, and people were getting killed by remaining wildlife. Some couldn't mentally handle the reality of the situation, so immediately just went to virtual reality to just not deal with the problems at hand. And pretty much every single doctor within the entire society would die out personally due to the fact that they were directly on the front lines during this pandemic. Dr. Gross would personally flee from the scene simply due to the fact that 1, she didn't want to contract the illness, but 2, she didn't want to face the music of what she had done. Regardless, her actions were directly responsible for the death of Minerva. Finn's mother would contract the disease and her body would slowly fail her. This would force her to upload her consciousness into the computer computers in order for her to save humanity by becoming hundreds of helpers. However, do not be mistaken, Minerva is still dead. Her consciousness that we see is simply a copy of the original, while the original body was completely destroyed and digitized. However, her sacrifice would not be in vain, as she would manage to save a couple hundred humans. Now, I could go over Minerva as well as the various other humans, however, I would like to kind of skip over this simply due to the fact that a good amount of them are getting their own videos to begin with. But one thing that is particularly important is the fact that after the humans would come back at the end of the series, 1,000 years later down the line, they seem to have gone completely extinct or again endangered. I would like to speculate on this, but here's the thing, the amount of information that we actually know on why this became the way it is completely unknown. It's possible that they simply weren't ready for the land of Ooo and their technology simply was unable to save them, but I find this somewhat unlikely. But I'm not gonna lie, this video is gonna be incredibly short because the fact of the matter is Matthew just does not have that much screen time. He appears in 2 episodes, one of which he did not even show up personally. And in The Mountain, the episode in which he is originally introduced, the episode primarily focuses on lemon grabbing. Considering that he's already getting his own 30-minute video on himself, I don't really see why I would cover him in this particular episode. Due to the fact that this episode is not based around him, he only actually obtains around 2 minutes of screen time before he is dispersed by lemon grab. However, despite his negligible screen time, it should be noted that his character does have some interesting points about it, so let's go ahead and dive right into it. Starting off strong, we have Matthew himself. Matthew is technically not a single individual, but instead the essence of dozens of individuals fused together in order to create one single mind. One thing that is rather interesting is that we know he is incredibly ancient. Considering his legend and his mountain seems to be incredibly well known to the inhabitants of Ooo, as well as the fact that he seems to have some level of understanding of the events that took place 1,000 years ago. In fact, his main goal is to incorporate enough individuals into himself until he obtains enough power to eventually merge as an entirely different entity. You see, he desires to reach this godlike status so that when the second age of terror comes, he can reform the world, utilizing his immense power in order to restructure the world and grant eternal peace. Typically, many people come to his mountain in search of him. The exact reasons for why can definitely be different depending on who comes. However, one thing that tends to always be the case is that they seem to have some kind of internal struggle. Lemongrab was now in a position where he had it all. He had a fully functioning lemon society and had everything that he ever wanted, but despite this fact, he was still incredibly unsatisfied. And so he would eventually seek out Matthew. Now, those who seek out Matthew must enter a particular tunnel. And one thing that should be noted is that when you reach this, you have to pick out one of 3 ways. A mirror will begin to show visions of 3 things, one of which being your desires, the others being your fears and relationships, and the final being your past. The correct choice is the past, as the only way to embrace Matthew is to relinquish your past in order to make way for the future. If you give in to your desires or fears, most likely you will not be able to reach Matthew due to the fact that the idea of you relinquishing yourself is incredibly slim. Now, if you do select the right option and make it a Matthew, one of the first things that he'll do is pretty much describe who he is and offer the chance to merge with him. Now, he would offer this idea to Lemongrab, and Lemongrab would give it some thought. However, upon meeting Matthew, he could do nothing but detest him. The reason for this is simple, which is the fact that Matthew is a liar. He lures in individuals who lack purpose, and those who simply cannot live with themselves as they currently are. The reason this is important is due to the fact that he continuously tries to lure these people in and constantly offers them ideas of grandeur and living for something greater than themselves. But in reality, all he's doing is continuously adding to himself at the expense of others, an incredibly selfish act. He also further detests him due to the fact that he is an infinite staircase with something that doesn't truly have purpose due to the fact that he can never fulfill the goal that he had set out. In truth, all Matthew was just an older, wiser version of what Lemongrab used to be, a power-hungry, narcissistic madman. There's also a secondary lesson to be learned from Matthew, which is the idea that you need to learn how to live on your own. Your ambitions and ideas must come from you as a person rather than from an outside source. Those things can become a part of your life, however, you should not be consumed by them, such as a person completely consumed by the church or someone who would become incredibly dependent in a relationship. You need your own substance in order to become your own individual. And we actually do see a small glimpse of this within the episode. When the monks that make up Matthew were dispersed by Lemongrab, one of the first things that immediately happened was a lot of them immediately lost their minds. Due to the fact that they had basically given everything that they had in order to make Matthew, they pretty much lost everything, and some immediately killed themselves while others immediately began to lash out in anger. Looks like we're talking about Sweet Pea today. Now, one thing I'm going to be saying right off the bat is the fact that we're going to be going over an entire character analysis on him later on. However, today I'm just going to be going over the basis of his character along with his connection to the Lich. I'm also going to be going over his supposed biology as well as what happened to him 1,000 years later into the future. With that being said, let's begin. Now, wasting no time, Sweet Pea is the rebooted form of the Lich and by extension the vessel at which the essence of the Lich is being contained. Sweet Pea was born after the undead body of the Lich was rebooted thanks to the help of Citadel Guardian blood. Now, one thing that I have to say almost immediately right off the bat is the fact that the two are entirely different beings. Sweet Pea and the Lich share entirely different memories, ideals, as well as their own individuality, and they are in a continuous struggle in order for one to basically be the protagonist of the body. Now, Sweet Pea is incredibly interesting due to the fact that not only is he the vessel for the Lich, but he's also an entirely different being on his own, as well as the fact that he is basically a gigantic baby man, literally. When the Lich's form was rebooted, he was given an entirely new set of organs, including muscles, tissue, and pretty much everything else in between, and this includes the brain. This is why Sweet Pea himself, although he's obviously more intelligent than someone for his age, he is still by all means pretty much a baby by the time we actually interact with him. Now this made him a perfect candidate to become a good guy simply due to the fact that Mr. Pig and Tree Trunks would have a chance to raise him to become an incredibly respectable fellow. Now although I already mentioned that the Lich and Sweet Pea are two separate individuals, they are still intrinsically linked. This results in various things, such as him seeing memories of their past lives. This usually translates into very strange dreams, such as him being able to basically dream about particular memories that the Lich had experienced either as his time as a Catalyst Comet or as his time as the Lich. Now as you can imagine, looking to the mind and memories of a primordial entity that is older than time probably isn't that great for your mental health, so it always devolves into a nightmare. It especially doesn't help that the Lich is continuously trying to force Sweet Pea to embrace him by tormenting him with various memories, pretty much continuously whispering to Sweet Pea to give up his own body for the Lich to inhabit, as well as embrace the darkness that is within him.
Evil.
Whoa! Get off him!
Now this leads us into the relationship between the two, and believe me, it is not healthy in the slightest. Interestingly enough, considering every single version of the Lich has the exact same memories, other versions of the Lich, specifically the Farm World version, would call him son, which actually would make sense considering that Sweet Pea is by all means a descendant of the Lich. However, he obviously does this more in a joking matter because obviously he does not care about Sweet Pea at all, but simply having another partner in his continuous quest to destroy all life. Now one of the major reasons why I believe the Lich was so interested in Sweet Pea was due to the fact that he would prove as the perfect vessel. One of the major weaknesses of the Lich is the fact that he tends to actually have incredibly fragile bodies. Very few vessels ever allow him to utilize his power at 100% efficiency. However, this would have been a non-issue when it came to Sweet Pea. If the Lich had actually managed to transform Sweet Pea into a whole new incarnation of himself, he would have become one of the most powerful versions of the Lich. To give you an idea of just how powerful we're talking the full 100% power of the Lich, plus a near invulnerable body which is immune to 90% of all magic, and when Sweet Pea was fully grown, he had the exact same size as a Primordial. To put it bluntly, he was a beefy boy and was larger than mountains, and if the Lich had obtained that incredible power, nothing would have stood a chance against him, especially with the help of a fully powered Farm World Lich, which most likely would have happened. Now luckily for every single living creature alive, this would never actually come to pass, due to Sweet Pea getting over his own insecurities, as well as believing himself to be who he truly was, which was by all means a good individual. He would suppress the Lich and defeat the Farm World Lich. Now what a lot of people tend to get wrong is that the Lich pretty much died here, and that cannot be further from the case. The Lich is still there. Here's the thing, you cannot get rid of the Lich. There is just no way you can do it. He is the literal embodiment of evil, and even if you destroy his physical form, he will eventually return. In this particular case, all Sweet Pea is doing is simply suppressing him, which is absolutely insane when you realize that Sweet Pea is continuously suppressing the Lich with sheer willpower alone. However, by all means, the Lich is still there, and if an opportunity ever arises for him to possibly take control of the body, you bet your butt that he's definitely going to go for it. Now moving on from Sweet Pea's original form, let's go ahead and talk about the one that we see 1,000 years later into the future. And let me tell you, it's definitely something else. Not only is he the literal size of mountains, but he also possesses the Nightblade, one of the most powerful artifacts in the world. Now this actually is pretty interesting because it could mean that he was mentored by Finn in order to become a more powerful warrior later in life. However, I feel as though him having a sword is far more important than a lot of people give it credit for. Now, I've mentioned this many times in many videos, however, let me go ahead and go in detail here, which is the idea that's possible that Finn gave him the sword specifically in order to deal with the Lich. You see, the Night Sword has a very interesting ability, with its power basically being designed in order to suppress the power of incredibly powerful and malevolent creatures such as ghosts, demons like Hunts and Abadir, and quite possibly the Lich. So considering that Sweet Pea was having the Sakuna treatment, it's possible that he gave it to him specifically to combat this. Now the last thing that I thought I should mention is whether or not I believe the Lich could ever return, and the answer is absolutely. As I mentioned before, his essence can never be destroyed or removed, so considering that his essence is still in Sweet Pea, well, this means that there's still a chance. However, I do not see him coming back easily, considering Sweet Pea has most likely done everything he can to make sure that that never happens. However, I can see this happening within 3 certain scenarios, such as Sweet Pea's death, whether or not Sweet Pea is in a life or death situation and the Lich tries to take over in the meantime, or possibly if he willingly allows him. However, I do not see that last one happen. So let's start off with Sweet Pea's death. Now this one is actually the most likely, considering Sweet Pea has been alive for over 1,000 years and he's bound to die eventually, considering I do not believe he is actually immortal. After the 1,000-year time skip, it is quite clear that he did in fact age, age, growing out a beard, growing out his hair, showing small wrinkles, as well as increasing in size. So taking this into consideration, it's possible that he's not fully immortal, and this means that when he dies of natural causes, the Lich can basically just swoop in, take the corpse, and obtain all that juicy power. There's also a possibility of him dying to physical injury, however I don't really see that happening considering this man has survived over 1,000 years of battle. However it happens, one thing is definitely certain, which is the fact that Sweet Pea is a ticking time bomb. One thing I thought I should also mention is that it's possible that Sweet Pea may be actually the body of a primordial, considering that he not only possesses a somewhat greenish yellow color, which many other primordials possess, and his continuously growing size and power is also something that should be concerned about. But that's just a fun little theory.
I'll grab your butt cheeks and pull out my willy, stir your ass like a hot bowl of chili.
Looks like we're talking about the deer today, and even though it's easily one of the weirdest individuals within the Adventure Time story, why do you guys keep on asking me for people who only have about 2 minutes of screen time? This is easily going to be one of the shortest videos I've ever done. And no, I'm not just doing this one in order to make up for time due to the fact that I still haven't been able to finish the Owl House and still have to do a video on Bellows. Why would you even bring that up? Work, for the love of God, please! Moving on from my streaming issues, which won't allow me to finish a very simple show, let's go ahead and talk about this deformed deer. And yes, I 100% mean it when I say deformed because it is a flat-out mutant. Considering that it's intelligent as well as possessing full-on fingers, I have to assume that it's a descendant of humans who were mutated by the mushroom bomb. This happens to be the case when it comes to many of the beast races that we see, a good example of this being Chuscoos, who I'm not going to dwell on because for some reason he seems to always dwindle his way into every single video I do about the mushroom bomb, so we're just going to stop talking about him right now. Moving on, let's talk about the absolute atrocity of this deer. Now, one thing that we always have to factor in is...
He's strong!
Like, way stronger than I ever could have possibly anticipated. The guy was able to easily go toe-to-toe with Finn and Jake and beat them on pretty much 2 separate occasions until Jake was able to get the drop on him by dropping cinder blocks onto his head while he was floating above them. He was able to give Finn and Jake brain damage, being able to put Finn into a coma after breaking both of his legs and giving Jake amnesia. Oh, but it definitely didn't end there, considering he ended up assaulting pretty much every single member of the Candy Kingdom in search for their sugar. And I don't know if you've ever looked up the Urban Dictionary for giving someone sugar, but trust me, I'm not talking about it here. Moving aside the topics that will definitely get me demonetized, let's go ahead and talk about how the fact that he was able to pretty much defeat every single member in the Candy Kingdom and completely encase them in his bodily fluids. No, that was not a sentence I was expecting to say today, nor do I ever hope to say that sentence again. He captured, assaulted, and then slathered every single Candy Kingdom member in his own bodily fluids and then stuck them onto a wall for later use. He somehow was even able to capture a combination of Princess Bubblegum and Peppermint Butler, even though this was after the fact that we found out that Peppermint Butler dealt with death and demons pretty much every single week. Anyway, that's all I got for this video. I'm really curious who actually decided to make this character. Who at the table was just like, let's make an incredibly weird, slimy deer who likes to lick people. Anyway, I hope you like this video. This video is definitely not what I typically do, considering I probably added way more editing stuff than I usually do, but at the same time, I had a lot of fun with it regardless of the very strange topics that were pretty much put at hand. Anyway, if you like this video, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, and don't be afraid to pretty much put any recommendation or request within the comments. And as always, I will see you in the next video. Bye.
Then something just snapped. Something inside of me. I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about being better than Kakarot. I didn't care about being a Super Saiyan. I didn't care if I lived. I didn't care about anything. And then it happened.